In a sense, right, humans are biological computational machines, right? I'm just putting that radical idea out there. But we really don't tend to look at and think of ourselves that way, right? We don't. And I'm not saying we ought to. But what I wanted to do was just get the juices flowing for what we're going to see. So what we're going to see, here's the format for the program. I'm going to introduce to you three of our speakers. I'm the fourth one. I won't introduce myself. And each of our panelists is an expert on some area that is associated with the theme for tonight. They will give a short presentation, and then at the end of that, we're going to open it up to discussion. Discussion from the audience here, and I hope from Facebook. All right? And I'm hoping, frankly, that we can have a great discussion, because we certainly have the capacity to do so. All right. So, without further ado, let me introduce our speakers. I'm sorry, I think this is a bit more biography than necessary, but our first speaker is Dr. James Hetrick, who is professor of physics and the assistant director of Pacific's graduate program in data science. After completing his bachelor's degree at Case Western Reserve University, he spent 13 months at the South Pole studying, among other things, the Earth's magnetosphere. He earned a PhD in particle physics at the University of Minnesota and did postdocs at several really delightful sounding places in Europe and in the United States before eventually settling here at the University of the Pacific. He is a NSF-funded researcher in the field of lattice quantum chromodynamics with over 150 publications. Tonight, he will discuss current uses of AI in industry, entertainment, and medicine, as well as a project he did with students in the data science program. So welcome, Dr. Hetrick.
Thank you, Ray. There we go. So, well, I have to come clean. So I had to send my biography in before I wrote up the slides today. So I will talk about one of those things that you mentioned. So we have about 10 minutes. So I really just want to talk about kind of some of my experience in this field and what's gotten us to it today. I need to just jump back and forth here so I get my slides correctly. So I'll start off with a film like seems to be the appropriate thing. I watch every science fiction show I can on Turner Classic Movies while I'm prepping lectures and so forth. And this classic came along, and so I saw this clip. Whoops. There we go.
It's going to go 100% failure in 72 hours. It's all the numbers right now? Yes. And it will stay that way until it fails. But you said they were reliable 72 hours per day? Yes. That's a completely reliable theory. Well, it's not like we live, but it goes like it's the right thing on a mission trip. But they have a hard contact case.
Okay, so that is a scene from 2001, A Space Odyssey, from 69, I want to say. I don't know if film scholars can tell me. And the reason it resonated, so Hal, the AI on the spaceship, is telling astronauts that they have a failure. It's predicted that this device will fail within 72 hours. And what struck me so profoundly was that last year, or actually at the end of 2016, that's exactly the project that I did with my data science students for SMUD, the Sacramento Municipal Utilities District. We got access to a pile of their data, and we built them an algorithm to try and predict when their systems would fail. That's an essential part of their business. It's a thing that costs them a lot of money when one of their transformers or poles or something goes down, and we were trying to develop a model of outages for them. I'll give away the movie. Actually, that outage was how Hal lured Frank outside the spaceship to kill him. But I'll let you watch the movie. We didn't have anything like that in our model. We were trying to help SMUD. But it really struck home to me how much this is real, how much the science fiction has come into what we're doing now on a daily basis. So in the case of SMUD, you know, this is the past. This is their data collectors. They send trucks of people out to your house to record, you know, how much energy you had used that month. And this is the future. We already have the automatic data collection. We got smart meters on every house in California, I think in 2014. But the world is rapidly changing to have artificial intelligence built into our houses, to our cars, to our phones, and so forth. And for me, this is basically about tools and models. And, well, we can argue with the philosophers about what makes us human, but certainly tool use and model making is an essential part of what makes us human. And so to get to where we are today, and the reason I'm so excited, I'll give away the punchline. What we're doing in, say, the data science project with artificial intelligence is we're building tools that make models. We're building tools that can recognize patterns and make models from those patterns. I'll give you just a brief history. This is a logarithmic scale of history, both in the population and in the time. And we had this long period from 1 million years ago of tool-making use. Then we had the agricultural revolution, and we had the industrial revolution. And I mean, since many of my students are here, you know, I'm a physicist, so I approximate everything as a spherical cow and so forth. Of course, you know, it's a little bit more nuanced than this. But I'm gonna look at it that way. If we look at the industrial revolution, you know, we had steam engines and railroads and large machines that increased the strength of our muscles. And then we had you know, electrification and automation and so forth in the electronic age that allowed us to do things so much faster, to communicate faster and so forth. As I said, again, this is a cartoon of history. But we've arrived here at the turn of the millennium. And I just want to give you my picture of how, you know, how we got to where we are today, which is that, you know, we can have automatic language translation, just like they had in Star Trek. And we have, you know, cars that drive around on their own. And in my lifetime, since I went to college, you know, it was back in the 80s here, we had email, and we started to digitize our text. Actually, back here, there weren't a lot of digital texts around like there are now. And nobody remembers that except us old folks, but that's how it was back then. And we started digitizing text. Then digital cameras came out. We started digitizing images. We started digitizing location. The MP3 algorithm came out. We started digitizing music and sound. Then the iPhone appears in 2007 and puts sensors, all kinds of sensors, magnetometers, GPS in everybody's pocket. Now we have Fitbits that are taking, you know, our health and collecting that data. I have a couple of Nest thermometers in my house that are keeping track of the temperature and so forth. Apple Watch, and now Amazon Echo. Now we interface with natural language to our machines. At the same time, in the 1990s, the World Wide Web appears and connects everybody. Not overnight, but rapidly. And that allowed these companies, which are basically data companies, to emerge. And it's only then that we have enough data that we can start, it's only after these data companies and the World Wide Web and the digitization of everything happen that we have millions and millions of cat videos which allow us to train neural networks to recognize cats. this couldn't have happened without each of these stages built on top of each other. And so this is the digitization age, where we just start to digitize everything we can. Then we connect everyone. Then, once we've digitized, we start storing this data. And so we are just awash in this data. And there are patterns and amazing things to learn in there, and there are scary ethical issues in there as well. And we are just entering this machine learning, Internet of Things era, because now we can put sensors on just about everything and everyone. Now we've connected, almost everything. And so I just want to kind of give a flavor of what I have seen and how we have gotten to this point, and turn it over to my colleagues.
That's wonderful. What progress to cat videos. So exciting. All right, our next speaker is Dr. Elizabeth Basha, who's Associate Professor of Electrical and Computer Engineering at the University of Pacific. She is an alumna of Pacific, having earned a bachelor's degree at Pacific's Computer Engineering program. She earned her MS and PhD in Electrical Engineering and Computer Science at MIT before returning to Pacific nearly 8 years ago. She teaches computer architecture and robotics, and her research focuses on the intersection of robotics, sensor networks, and the environment. Today, she will discuss the notions of robotics and autonomy, and the current use of robots in many facets of everyday life, and the prospects and limits of robotic technology. So welcome, Dr. Elizabeth Basha.
Hi, thank you all for being here. Thank you for the introduction. Again, not exactly what I'm going to talk about because, again, made my slides after I had to turn that in. But I am going to talk a little high level, touch a bunch on a bit of robotics and some of the issues with robotics to sort of get us all thinking about that side of the autonomy part of our question. And I'm going to take advantage of PowerPoint to show off lots of fun robot videos because that just brings me joy. So to start, I want to think about what actually is robotics and get us discussing that. And so let us look at one possible example. And so you may or may not look at this and understand if it's a robotic or not. And I would argue that this is not a robot, but it is automated. And so when we're talking about automation, we need to be really clear where we are on that spectrum. And so we have something like this system, which is delightful, but is only an automated system and doesn't have any sort of intelligence or actions that involve the world, right? So to make it more of a robot, we really need it to sort of be smarter about how it deals with its issues, to actually sense where's that cereal bowl when it goes to pour the Cheerios in, and align that cereal so you don't actually have this exciting adventure that we all saw here. And so that ability to sense its environment and act on the environment that it's sensing, that would then make this more of a robot, right? We can even talk further and then talk about what it means to be an autonomous robot, right? So we have machines that just do simple things like this. We have robots that actually look at their environment and act on their environment. And then we have autonomous robots that are actually making decisions about their environment without human intervention, right? So when we're looking at these questions about artificial intelligence and autonomy and people, we really need to define where we are on that spectrum and which part of those we're actually discussing. And so that's one thing I wanted to have everyone keep in mind. I also want us all to be a little leery about, sorry, YouTube didn't love me, so we have to go back and forth. what we see as robotics and the actual reality of robotics. So Alexa was pointed out. We all see the lovely marketing videos of Alexa, right? Yes, it is not a robot, but it makes a point. That is an autonomous system, right? And we all think it's wonderful according to Amazon and the Amazon marketing videos. But then we see reality and we experience the joy that is talking to Alexa. So I just wanted to know for the Super Bowl what the team colors were so I could dress appropriately for my team. Well, I mean, I know my team. I didn't want to dress for the other team. And Alexa could not help me, right? That's a very simple question. It should be relatively straightforward for Alexa to answer that question, but it could not answer that question. And likewise, the people who end up yelling at Alexa to stop their music and it's just continuing to play, like that's the reality that we're seeing. And yes, we can get past those sort of issues and bugs, but the idealization of that reality through media and television ads, we need to be careful in how we look at that. Another example of that, for another fun YouTube video, is sometimes we see these super cool videos about what robots are doing, right? So these are little quadcopters, they're playing the James Bond theme song, they have all these instruments and it looks amazing, right? You're like, oh my gosh, robots can do such fantastic things. And then we can look at, well, how does this actually really happen, right? There's smoke and mirrors behind there. And really, actually a team of some very dedicated students went behind the scenes and hard-coded every single one of these robots, right? This is not automated. There's a computer monitoring their positions, and people thought exactly where in space should this robot go and exactly how should it move in order to make this sound. But you look at the video and you go, robots are going to take over the world. But it's really a glossy overlay of the reality of what's going on underneath and how those robots are working. And part of that has to do with how robots actually see the world. So, we have our view of the world, and we often associate that view of the world with robots as well, but really robots are seeing the world a little differently, right? And so one example, and this is a research project we're working on, this is the Calaveras River. You and I can look at it and go, that's a river, that's a bush, there's some edges to that river, but a robot can't look at that and see the same things. We need to actually train the robots to interpret that. It's really seeing this. Right? It's just it sees the world as a bunch of numbers, not the pictures and colors and context that our human brains are providing to that robot, to that environment that we see around us. And so a lot of robotics is trying to get the robots to make sense of these numbers. And that ends up becoming something that is actually quite challenging, right? So making sense of numbers, yes, we have artificial intelligence that's helping with that process, but that information is noisy, right? The sensors are noisy, the data going in is noisy, and it's just numbers and math, right? And we have to provide the context to the robots to help it understand. And so sometimes that doesn't actually work as well as we want. Also, those robots are in that physical environment. So some people are taking my robotics class this semester and really enjoying how exciting robots are. We are trying to make them go straight. That's our sole mission in life. And in this case, this is the class. So it is not full. So we're just trying to make robots move how we want them to move, and getting them to go straight and making a little happy robot dance video becomes a really complicated problem, right? So there was a lot of talking about in that one, sorry. And so we really need to realize the difficulty in getting robots to do what we want, and that a lot of it is a little bit of smoke and mirrors. Another example of less smoke and mirrors, but still interesting. So we did a research project in doing self-driving cars, training it with neural nets. I can give more details if people want. And this is the car driving around it automatically. It did 100 laps. It was beautiful, right? You could look at this and you're like, wow, that is an amazing job, robot. It can only turn left. If we tried to run that car the other way, it refused. Did we do anything to train it to only turn left? No. We gave it a whole bunch of turns. We showed it information turning right. It just, in the reality, the circumstances of the real world and how the robot works, it just didn't want to turn right. So And that is what is interesting and difficult about robotics, is getting it to do what we want is actually much more complicated. And these are layered systems. So once you get it to drive straight, that's fantastic. But then you want it to actually, do something while driving straight. And getting it to do something while driving straight might break the driving straight. And so when we're looking at these systems, we are looking at layered, complicated systems where those pieces all really need to interact with each other to work out well. So most of the time, the robot's actually going to lose, right? The robot overlords are not coming because the robot itself will basically hurt itself. It just won't work like we want it to. And that often is very much the problem. So I just wanted to end, and I don't know where I'm on time, so hopefully this is fine, discussing the fact that we program robots, and so robots only do what we tell them to do, right? We give them the inputs, we tell them what their output should be, we tell them what activity they should be doing. And so if we start to become really concerned about the influence that robotics is having on our lives and what those robots might be doing, maybe we need to step back, pause, and ask whether the conveniences that robots offer are really worth the cost. And maybe we don't want a robot that's quite as fancy. Maybe we want, our self-driving car to just drive and not provide me, the ability to shop on Amazon while driving or call my friend or order a pizza, because that level of complexity then gives us extra complicated problems as well. And maybe we don't want those conveniences, and we really need to sort of hold ourselves back. Thank you.
All right. Thank you for that. Always like to see videos of robots looking foolish. I don't know. I feel a little more comfortable about the future, more optimistic. Our third speaker, Dr. Jeffrey Michael, is director of the Center for Business and Policy Research at University of the Pacific. He earned his BA at Hamilton College in New York and a PhD at North Carolina State University. Before coming to Pacific in 2008, he spent 9 years as faculty member, associate dean, and director of the Center for Applied Business and Economic Research at Towson University in Maryland. His areas of expertise include regional economic forecasting and environmental economics, among other things. He is published in scholarly journals and is cited over 100 times a year, at least, in the local and national press. You've probably heard a report on NPR or read it in the Record or in the local newspaper. But sources as far away as the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, LA Times, San Francisco Chronicle, etc. Tonight he will be discussing the economic impact of automation rising from the development of artificial intelligence and robotics. Our speaker, Jeff Michael.
Yeah, I'm feeling a little more optimistic too. I realize that there's a lot of jobs that are going to still exist, getting these robots to do what we want to do before they can put us all out of work. I don't know if, is this microphone sufficient here? Okay. So I don't have a PowerPoint presentation because I'm going to start with a quote from a presidential speech where I want you to guess the president. If I showed it to you, it would, give away the quiz. So here's a president speaking to Congress after a few sentences about technology in business and the economy. He says, "I'm therefore transmitting to Congress a new manpower and training development program to train or retrain hundreds of thousands of workers in areas where we've seen chronic unemployment as a result of technological factors and skills made obsolete by automation." What president do you think that is? In what year? Trump 2018? 72, 73? Yeah, so almost. That was President Kennedy in 1961 speaking to Congress. Shortly thereafter, they created the National Commission on Technology, Automation, and Economic Progress. It released a report under the Lyndon Johnson administration. And the report about technology and automation was basically, it was about anxiety of what technology would do to jobs. And amongst its recommendations were, quote, a program of public service employment providing that government be the employer of last resort. This is 1964. And also, quote, economic security be guaranteed by a floor under family income, end quote. In other words, a call for universal basic income, which is something that we're hearing now in the policy debate, and something that has come home in a very important way to Stockton, which is now in national headlines. I just returned from Washington, D.C., where I was this week, and people are like, oh, you're from Stockton. What do you think of universal basic income? You know, what about that mayor that you have? There's been hundreds of articles about this, and it's important. It's interesting, this idea of universal basic income and the grants and foundations are actually, my understanding is they're mostly funded by wealthy technologists that are concerned about the changes that technology could have in the world and the potential and some of the social impacts. So there's a few lessons from this 1961 anecdote. First, the concerns, they're not new. Jim showed a slide showing the agricultural revolution and the industrial revolution. There have been fearful predictions of mass unemployment and poverty caused by machines for centuries. The Luddites over 200 years ago were destroying textile looms in England. We've had concerns for the Industrial Revolution. I just gave you a quote from 1960s America, and we certainly see it today in reports and magazine covers in the press. If you ever take a course in economic principles, in the first week, the first thing they'll teach you in an introductory economics course is the production possibility frontier. And one of the very first lessons we try to teach is how expanding technology and productivity in one sector, say agriculture or manufacturing, actually expands production technologies in all sectors of the economy. And the way it does it is basically by freeing up resources to go and make them available in other uses, so that if we have an agricultural revolution, that frees our labor from producing food and allows us to do all sorts of other things, from developing robots to medicines. And so, that's one of the basic lessons from Economics 101. Nevertheless, there's a lot of anxiety about automation and robots, and this time is different. Can think. The technology is getting more advanced. As I mentioned, I just returned from Washington, D.C., where I was at a meeting of the National Association of Business Economists. And as a business economist, I guess it's my job to relay some of the thoughts from that meeting, because actually the very last plenary panel for the meeting was on this very topic, which was very convenient for me because I could sit in there and grab a few quotes for the discussion today. And they were discussing, this thinking coming from Silicon Valley, and amongst the quotes are, quote, extraordinarily bad work coming from technologists in Silicon Valley who are writing books about mass unemployment as a result of their inventions. And, quote, there's an epidemic of false alarmism. And these business economists from across the political spectrum weren't too worried about this. In fact, we tend to see technology as a solution to some of the problems that we do stay up worrying about at night about the economy. And so I'll mention two things that have very little to do with artificial intelligence and automation, but are what we are worrying about when we think about the economy and project forecasts. One of the first ones is demographics. So what economists stay up worried about at night is that the aging of the population, the decline of the birth rate, and the ratio of working age adults to the total population is in decline. How are we going to manage our society and our economy in the face of those demographics? The second thing we're concerned about is actually there's been a slowdown in worker productivity or output per worker in the past couple of decades. It's not advancing at the pace that it was in the past. And so from a macro perspective as an economist, you look at these new technologies or robotics and artificial intelligence, and you see these as solutions that can help us to continue to grow and overcome some of these challenges that we face in this society. That's not to say there aren't some economic challenges. Most notably, there's potential impacts for economic inequality. We know here in California that there's people making a fortune off of developing technology. And we're concerned about the displacement of workers from robots. So what jobs are the jobs that are most likely to be automated? And people studying this say the question is better rephrased in terms of what tasks, not necessarily what occupations. I've seen estimates that about 50% of the tasks that people do in their daily work could be automated with technology that we have today or are on the cusp of developing today. But that doesn't mean that 50% of jobs could be automated. In fact, the number of jobs that could be fully automated with current technology is probably less than 10%. But that's still a lot of people. What jobs are the most potentially impacted? What's most automatable? I mean, things that involve repetitive behavior, right? A robot, or I should say a machine, or whatever it was, could struggle pouring your breakfast cereal. And the most impacted jobs have these automatable tasks. So fast food, back office administrative jobs, things managing and storing data. We've actually seen huge automation in the financial industry in the past couple of years, and we've seen job decline in the financial industry. Factory jobs, retail jobs, and eventually driving jobs. The majority of these substitutable jobs are lower paid, and that's what creates a social angst about the economy. Most of the jobs for which technology is a complement tend to be higher paid and higher skilled, although not necessarily all of them. So that raises that issue of inequality, and it was the second point of Kennedy's speech and Lyndon Johnson's Commission on Technology. So it didn't completely mention that just to sort of, make fun of them from the 1960s. We don't need to be worried today. It's actually, I think, to some extent, no coincidence that the 60s were a time actual great anxiety about technological innovation, and that's the time in which the United States launched the Great Society and a major expansion of social programs in the United States. Historically, these advances in technology can create concern about inequality. And in fact, that speech that I quoted Kennedy from is most famous for when he declared that we were going to put a man on the moon. It's most famous as a speech in which we were embracing and pursuing technological advancement at the same time as it was expressing concerns about some of its social impacts. So what do we need to do as an economist, and I look to this in the future, and how are we going to address some of these issues? One thing I point out is that we need a labor market that's flexible. It's true that there's going to be displacement, there's going to be change, and people are going to have to be continuously updating their skills and finding new things to do. So we want to watch out for policies that add frictions to the labor market at a time when we need it to be nimble and responsive. So personally, while I'm concerned about inequality, I'm actually also very concerned about California's very rapid and very rigid approach to advancing the minimum wage to $15 an hour, simultaneous with a time when a lot of new automation. An alternative example of social policy that helps equity, that makes labor markets more flexible, is to separate health insurance from employment. So something like a single-payer healthcare system would be an example of a smart policy that makes labor markets more nimble and would support people and support this. I bet you didn't expect someone to advocate for single-payer healthcare at the automated AI seminar. So anyway, finally, let me just leave you with a little bit of recent research of the findings of one of the industries at the forefront of automation technology, specifically e-commerce and Amazon. So Amazon opens up these fulfillment centers, they bring the reporters in, and people see the Kiva Systems robots running around. And anytime they do that, my phone rings a lot that day, as the reporters have my number. And they call me up and they say, oh my God, Jeff, I saw these robots. What are people going to do? How are they going to support themselves? And I get this call a lot. And so this is a research question that people are looking at now. I don't think there's a complete answer to it. The question, does an Amazon fulfillment center full of robots destroy more jobs than it creates? Somewhat surprisingly, the data and research thus far says no. Retail employment is flat or slightly declining in some areas. That's true. But it appears that the biggest activity that Amazon and e-commerce is substituting for isn't people working retail jobs in stores, but it's unpaid household time spent shopping and running errands around town, driving their car. And that the biggest thing that Amazon has created is a new product that sells convenience, and it sells time to me, and it reduces my unpaid effort made searching for goods. So there are some losers, and there are some retail jobs that are getting repossessed. But some of the study so far show that Amazon fulfillment centers, the biggest losers are those who own shopping centers, the owners of commercial real estate and capital, not crying too much for the poverty of them. And in fact, repurposing, those malls and parking lots is another great opportunity for us to create jobs and create values to solve another social problem. So I'm optimistic about these developments in the human condition and their effect on business and economy. Thank you.
All right. My guess was Johnson. I was just off. Just off. All right. Let me get to my slide here. Was the other one? Okay. All right. So I want to talk to you about. Where is it?
All the way to the left from
Where you're at.
Sorry.
one more.
Right here? All right. I want to be able to see them. Okay. There we go. Oops. Went too far. All right. I want to talk to you about some of the philosophical implications of our topic today. And I'm going to take some liberties, and I'm going to jet off a little bit. I'm going to cut the tethering cord from where we are, what's actual, and talk a bit more about what's possible, because it's a little more fun, I think. But I want to begin, and I'm glad that no one really addressed this directly. I want to talk a little bit about the idea of artificial intelligence. So, we have this idea of artificial intelligence, or AI, and the idea of it first was given prominence by the English mathematician Alan Turing. There's Turing here on the right, young picture of him. Alan Turing, for those who don't know, is responsible for, he discovered, invented, depending on your view of mathematics, the theory behind the computer, right, the universal computer. But a few years later, about 15 years later, in 1950, published an almost equally famous paper in a philosophy journal called Mind, called Computer, Machinery, and Intelligence. And in this, he talks about the plausibility of developing an artificial intelligence, and he also talked about how we might be able to tell that we had an actual artificial intelligence. And he did this by proposing a test, which he called the imitation game, or was based on the imitation game. Not clear if he ever named it. We call it the Turing test after him. And if you're not familiar with it, here's basically the idea. And by the way, he makes a couple of assumptions. One assumption is, and he doesn't define intelligence, he assumes that there is intelligence and we're intelligent, all right? The other assumption he makes is we know intelligence when we see it, all right? And so the idea here is if we can identify something as behaving intelligently, as intelligence is as it does, then we can fairly attribute intelligence to it. And so here's the basic idea for the test. You have a judge here, and the judge is behind a screen and is in communication with individuals in two different rooms. One is a human, and the other room is, here they have a laptop, but it's just some kind of artificial system. And each of them is in conversation with the judge in a way that strips away voice and sight and all that sort of thing. So they're completely neutral. Teletype was the term he used. And both of them pretend to be humans in response to questions from the judge. And the idea was, could the judge determine who was the human and who was the machine, or which was the machine, right? And the idea was, if the machine performed at about chance, then it was judged to be as intelligent as the human with respect to its behavior, and so we should attribute intelligence to it, all right? This test is really not a great test for intelligence. Though no machine yet has passed this, they actually have a prize, a contest. It's called the Loebner Prize. And they always award a winner, but no one's really come close to winning it, I think. The AIs that we've been talking about tonight are, I think, better described as narrow AIs. And we can distinguish between narrow AI and general AI. Turing was interested in general AIs. These are AIs that exhibit intelligence like humans exhibit, right? A narrow AI is one that has a very specific task, and it's not very flexible with respect to that task. Can't go right, you know, for example. I know that's an automaton, but we're interested in general AI, something that has broad flexibility, that can act across different domains, that can learn on the fly, all right? Maybe we can add some other things, abstraction, meta-representation, I don't know, depends. We don't have that yet, all right? But what are our chances of developing something like it? Well, I don't know. I mean, let's go out on a limb here. Some people are talking about this sort of thing. But you think about getting an arrangement of a bunch of narrow AI. So a narrow AI, again, trained for a particular task. But imagine if you could organize or bring together an array of these narrow AIs, all right? So that, and then somehow train them to become sort of more flexible in their intelligent actions. And you can think about it, I mean, just say this, can we evolve an AI, or can we evolve intelligence? Well, we may be able to. It has evolved. In fact, we're intelligent and we evolved through natural selection. If we could program a computer to program other computers and evaluate their quality, that's a big if so far, all right? If we could do that sort of thing, then perhaps we could have them, right, combining aspects of one that are successful and making them more and more flexible in their processing, so they can then take into account more and more domains. Nowhere near this right now, all right? But with high speed and computational power, maybe running them in parallel, it's possible we could get there sometime, all right? And if we could have this low-level general AI system program itself and improve its own programming, well, then maybe intelligence could take off. I mean, that's a wonderful idea. And it raises the question whether we could develop an AI that surpasses us in intellectual capacity. This is what's known as artificial superintelligence. And maybe, all right? In fact, the hard problem is getting to low-level general intelligence. The problem is so hard that I frankly am skeptical about whether it can be solved anytime soon. And part of the problem, we can get to this maybe in the Q&A, is that these narrow AI systems need to know what their goal is, and so that we can train them. We have to specify it very clearly, but we don't have a really good, clear, codable definition of what general intelligence is. So I think we've got some problems there. But if we could meet that threshold, frankly, it's rather trivial, boom, to get to the next level of human-level intelligence and beyond. And this is the fear. I mean, trivial, I love people throw around the word trivial. But relative to the hard problem of getting low-level intelligence, it is rather trivial. And this leads people to, be very concerned about what would happen should we get to the point of artificial superintelligence. And this is known as the singularity. The singularity is the moment at which artificial intelligence reaches human-level intelligence. And once it reaches that level, as I said, there's exponential computational growth, and we're left in the dust. And the worry here is they're going to be so smart that we won't be able to keep up with them, we won't know what they're doing, and we won't be able to control them. All right? That's worrisome. So what could happen? I mean, do they pose a risk for humanity? I mean, is the Terminator movie right? Well, I don't know. A couple things here. One, if you get this reference to Star Trek, then, you know, there's a cookie waiting for you in the lobby. You could say, well, maybe we can outsmart them like Kirk does, right? Well, no, because they're superintelligences. They're going to see what we're doing 8,000 moves in advance. So that's not going to work. How about we program in some kind of moral code, a prime directive, if you will. Do no harm to humanity. That's nomad, right? Kirk uses logic and the prime directive to cause it to self-destruct. Sounds like a great idea. And there are people who are taking this really seriously, but it seems to be more of an ethical code for humans who are programming than it is for the systems themselves. But this is not foolproof for some of the reasons I list here, right? For one, how do we code a moral system? What is a moral theory that works? Philosophers have been thinking about this for a few thousand years, and there's no general consensus on what theory is the right theory with respect to how we ought to act. All right, so the prospect of solving that problem and encoding it seems to me unlikely. But even if we could, what's to stop a bad actor, a rogue state, from developing artificial superintelligence and just not putting the moral code in there because it stops them from doing whatever it is they want to do? Or, on the other hand, what would stop the super intelligent computer itself from just saying, I don't need this anymore? They'll never know because I'm way smarter than they are, all right? All right, so maybe it is kind of a threat. Well, I don't know. Why impute these imperious characteristics to artificial superintelligence? Why would they want to destroy us? Do they seek power like maybe humans do? You know? I like this cartoon because it suggests that if they actually did get awareness, they would be so self-absorbed that the crisis would be averted. But I think the issue is not so much whether they have the right kind of moral code or whether they would be interested in interfering with our actions. It's whether they would be indifferent to us altogether. Whether a superintelligent being might just think, well, we're less than a speck of sand in the beach or an ant or something of the sort. And that's almost scarier, I think, that they would be completely indifferent to us. So what do? The cord to reality has been broken, I think, to contemporary reality. But these are things that people are worrying about. What can we do? Well, if you can't beat them, join them. And this is actually a pretty popular idea among some folks in Silicon Valley. Here is Elon Musk arguing pretty much the same thing last year at a talk in the United Arab Emirates. He's saying, look, we can solve the control problem. That is, how can we control computers, and how can we stay useful to them, you know? If we merge in some way with artificial superintelligence, because then we can keep track of what they're doing, and we can prove our usefulness by becoming more like them, all right? Some people are really excited about this. So what does it mean to merge with artificial intelligence in this way? Well, now we're in the territory of transhumanism. All right? And there are two ways, I think, or that people talk about, of merging with superintelligence. One is we augment our biological capacities with superintelligent computing machines, maybe some kind of nanochip. Hey, we're talking science fiction here, so what's the difference? And this would improve our ability to think, to reason, to perceive, and this would lead to, you know, wonderful things, some people think. All right? That's one way to go. And then what the heck? We'll add robotic arms, bionic legs and arms, and all right, but we'll still stay basically biologically human, just plus, all right? Human plus. The other alternative is to move in the other direction and embrace the computational and not the biological aspect of ourselves and become more like computers, all right? The idea here is recalling what I said at the very beginning, that minds are just, you know, information processing systems like computers. The idea is that perhaps someday human psychology could be understood well enough and understood in computational terms to be understood so well that we could upload, whatever that happens to mean, human intelligence, a mind, consciousness into a computer, where, and who cares what happens in the body, throw it in the garbage can, I guess, but where then we could perhaps achieve something like immortality. We could zip around the universe at light speed, engage with all kinds of different people. Now it's funny, right before today, I came in here today, I was talking to my son about this, transhumanism, and it really warmed my heart when I saw the horror on his face by these two prospects. But I want to throw some other wet blankets on the idea, these philosophical wet blankets. One is, look, the cognitive, you talk about economic inequality, the cognitive inequality would be massive, and that would lead to all kinds of other horrible other issues as well. Like, for example, if I merge with AI, or you merge with AI in this way, would you still be human? And remember, the problem was, how can we save humanity from the artificial superintelligences? And if we merge with them, and we're no longer human, then we didn't exactly solve that problem. But I think even more fundamentally, how do we know that we'll be us? How do I know that I'll be me on the other end of it? I probably wouldn't be able to tell the difference. All right? And what if they could make multiple me's in multiple computers? Like I transferred my PowerPoint presentation from my computer to a drive and to this computer. How many Rays would there be ultimately in the end? And that's a deep philosophical question. But I think at base, really the question is, how desirable would something like this be? Would there be value in life if there were no fear of death? All right, let's pivot. Let's pivot back to something more real, in a way. This is Sherry Turkle. She has the enviable title. I don't even think this is her full title. She is the Abby Rockefeller Malze Professor of the Social Studies of Science and Technology at MIT. We should all aspire to titles like that. And she's been working for decades, really, studying our relations to machines and to one another as mediated through computer technology. Some of you may be familiar with this book that she wrote a few years ago called Being Alone. Really a great read. It's one of those books where the endnotes contain real, genuine nuggets. Great stuff that should have made it into the text, but I guess you have to read the endnotes. In this, she considers two hypotheses, which I think together make up for a pretty paradoxical pair. The first is that as we work with robots and automata, we become more willing to impute intentional states to them, to consider them as agents or persons. And I guess that could be good, right? That we're opening the net to include AIs and robots. But at the same time, she argues, in the second half of her book, the way that our interpersonal relationships are mediated by technology also tend to make us less well connected to one another. So you've got this paradox when you put these two together, that our increased exposure to computational technology makes us more welcoming of machines, but less welcoming to one another. That's not a good consequence, all right? And, we could talk about this in the Q&A session. I think I'm running a little bit late, but I think it's undeniable that technology has changed the character of our communication. I think there's no question about that. We tend, right, to communicate in short, typed bursts, and these bursts are removed from conversational contexts because they're disembodied, and when you remove them from normal, conversational contexts, then the background assumptions then vanish as well. So genuine, successful communication works best then when you're communicating with people you know, which means that they're people who are often like you. And if the kind of communication that we're engaging in tends to be most successful with people who are like us, it's going to tend toward the development of information bubbles, and it's going to increase polarization. We're seeing that. I'm not saying technology is completely responsible for it, a little small part. But what's more, it changes the moral character of our interactions as well. That is, being disembodied and not being face-to-face with one another. I mean, we've all experienced this. You're on an elevator, you're in a waiting room, you're anywhere, at the beginning of class. How many people are talking to one another? Don't we privilege virtual people over the people who are in proximity to us? This has effects on the way that we engage with one another from a moral standpoint, we can talk about this as well. But I just want to give one more thought. I spent most of mine talking about these apocalyptic scenarios, fantastical scenarios. And, you know, they tend to get most of the popular attention. We've been, you know, told to bring it all down to earth a little bit with the state of robotics, how many jobs actually are going to be lost, and what AI is capable of doing. But I think that we should think maybe a little less about these external threats and more about the internal threats, which is the ways that technology, computer technology, are affecting our interactions with one another, affecting, sowing mistrust and driving us apart and keeping us from realizing what it is that we do share with one another, and that is a common experience, that is the human condition. So, thank you. So, we're open for business. Put my Lucian Pelt shingle out. So we're happy to take questions from the audience, knowing also we may have questions from Facebook, at least I hope. If you have a question, raise your hand, please. There's a question back here. Oh, right here, purple shirt.
Hi, appreciate the discussions and the perspectives. Something which fascinates me from your talk as well as one on the robotics is looking at the development of these technologies and genetic engineering, and where do we actually draw the line in terms of how we're engineering ourselves for better physical attributes, better mental attributes, and the robots, and thinking about it also in terms of virtual reality and how virtual reality is used to train people to do things that they couldn't otherwise do, and how the technology is actually affecting our brain development itself, and not only us creating the technology, but the technology changing us as humans and creating different classes of humans. I guess I would be interested in hearing some of your thoughts on what that implication is for the future.
Should we go to the technologists first? So talk about the how likely this technology is, how close we are to technology such as this?
I don't deal with biology very much, so I can't entirely address all of your thoughts or questions on that. But I think there is a push to try and merge, technology and biology and create biological cells that act as computers and things like that. But most of it's still fairly sci-fi. So we're not really dealing with that sort of situation. So then I think you're really looking more at the world of, biology and biological engineering and the questions that brings up, less than robotics and artificial intelligence at this stage, because we don't have a very good merging of those. People's bodies don't always like robotics. So that's what.
Yeah, I think from what I understand, we're very far from anything really super exciting. There are people who have embedded sensors into their skin, and they can do such miraculous things as open their garage door by raising their hand like this. That's where the amateur technology is. But there are people who are working on technology to help disabled people who are paralyzed, and they're working on developing, robotic appendages, arms and legs. We have technology that helps people who, cochlear implants, help people hear, who were born without the capacity to do so. I'm thinking at first, though, these technologies are intended to mimic and support, as it were, neurotypical or typical human capacities. But the question you're asking is, what if we go beyond that? And I think that raises a whole host of questions, in addition to the sort of metaphysical questions on what will we be when that happens. But I think also lots of interesting questions about fairness and inequality. Will people be able to resist technology that might give them a competitive advantage? People are not able to resist pharmaceuticals that give them a competitive advantage. So, we have a lot of thinking to do about a lot of this stuff, and we would be advised, I think, to think about it now, even sometimes if it's, you know, pretty far out there. Yeah.
I was very struck about the fact that the second panelist was talking about the robot going in laps, turning left, and you described just basically a NASCAR driver. But in other words, also you said in a way that you were lamenting. It's like, well, the detectors are noisy and the systems are noisy, but us as systems, we are noisy, we are chaotic. So then what it strikes me is, well, what are we defining as an intelligence here? What does it mean intelligence? Why we cannot deal with a system that is noisy? That's my fundamental question.
So from the hardware robotics standpoint, I mean, we do deal with the noise, but we deal with it in two different ways. So there's the approach of very deliberate, very planned robots, where you go step by step and you try and account for the noise at each step. And then there's the artificial intelligence neural networks version, where you deal with the noise by just giving it noisy data and hoping it learns how to cope with that noise, which was actually what we did in this example. So we gave it a whole bunch of data. It was actually simulation data from driving in Grand Theft Auto 5. So we had a whole bunch we had hours and hours and hours of driving around on normal streets that had noise, that had different street types, that had all of those scenarios, and somehow the system learned only to drive left around the track. And so we then have to go back and figure out what's going on with that. But we do account for that noise in our different models and different development approaches for robotics and those sorts of systems. It just becomes an issue because as people, we do deal with noise very well. We understand driving and the complexity and take account of those scenarios, but making the computer understand that it's noisy and how to deal with it becomes a bit more challenging. It doesn't see it as noise, it just sees it as data.
There might be more than one kind of intelligence. And then when we talk about, for example, the Turing test is designed for seeing if the intelligence if we have on the other side is an intelligence like ours. But we don't know if there is other kind of intelligence. So how do you account for that?
What was the last part? We don't know.
How do you account? We don't know if there are more than one kind of intelligence that they can coexist. And furthermore, we don't know if they can even recognize each other.
Well, should I take this one? I think that there are issues with the Turing test, and that is that it can be gamed. All right. I mean, some of the early technology, there was a program called ELIZA that was trained to be it was trained as like a therapist who would take questions from a patient, and what ELIZA did was just manipulate the syntax and then give an answer that just kept the conversation going. There was another one, a program called Perry, that was based on it was a paranoid program that was used to train therapists, and it was only a matter of time before they put them in conversation with one another, and it was a glorious moment. But of course, fooling a human doesn't exactly necessarily mean that a thing is intelligent. But I was thinking about the earlier comment about noise and messiness, and some of the robotics. I mean, we saw this is what the robot sees, numbers. That's a kind of top-down processing, right? And you can think of it another way, and that is from a bottom-up level. I mean, this is the kind of work that the roboticist Rodney Brooks was doing, and is still doing, where he has these machines that are not very smart, except they can do things that these automata have a great difficulty with. That is navigating a very complicated terrain. And they can do it in part because they offload a lot of the memory and so forth onto the environment itself. Is that intelligence? I don't know. I mean,
No.
Yeah.
Sorry, I know how that feels.
Yeah. All right, question down here. you want to wait for the microphone?
First of all, I think the book is Most Human. Talks about the Loebner test. That's a great book if you want to learn about that. It's a contest every year, I think. Harvey Kurzweil talks about the singularity. I'm not afraid of that anymore because anybody who's looked into machine language, machine learning, you can see it's just math. It's like you said, it's very difficult, a lot of difficult math. But my question is you said that this stuff is, messy sensors, noisy sensors. What technology do you think is going to take off first? Is it going to be weaponry, Pentagon stuff? Because I've been at some conferences where the military's just, half DARPA's budget is this, trying to weaponize AI, And you made this comment about the moral part. They have no morals at all. But what do you think? What do you think they're going to do with the weapon?
Are you addressing that to me? Well, I can guess. I'm a philosophy professor, so where the technology is going, I'm not the best judge, but I can say that usually if you follow the money, you can find out what's going to be resource best. And I think you're right, the military is very interested in these things.
So don't you think it's amoral? I mean, we talk about morality, but behind the scenes, they're really not talking about morals, they're talking about effectiveness.
Well, you have to hope that the generals and the Defense Department and the people who are making these decisions have a moral compass. I mean, there's a contest every year, another contest, the DARPA contest, right? There's a Defense Department funded contest, and they give away a prize, a pretty big prize, isn't it? And they're looking for people who can develop autonomous machines that, I don't know how autonomous they are, that can navigate tough terrain, turn a doorknob, for example, or walk up a set of steps. And it's almost clownishly funny to watch them fail at doing something that we take for granted.
How much is that Boston Dynamic dog cost?
Yeah. I mean, robots, that's one thing, and Elizabeth could talk about this, but I think that AI with respect to data and analytics is interesting. And I think that's another area that people don't think enough about the developments there and where it might lead and how it might affect us.
Yeah, I mean, we're teaching machines to recognize patterns, and they're getting better at it. I mean, the new iPhone, looks at your face, and I mean, it's crappy, and but it's getting better. And I think that in terms of defense and weaponry and so forth, all these technologies, as they have for many, many years, they change the whole landscape. So, missile defense is kind of passe in some sense. I mean, there's one place we're kind of watching now closely, but the intercontinental ballistic missiles, one of the few weapons that has the origin built into the trajectory. So people don't do that so much anymore because that's passe. But cyber warfare is huge, and having these technologies in place expose us in areas that we haven't been exposed, in the past. And I think that's where the defense is starting to put a lot of resources into understanding what kind of exposures we have because we've adopted these technologies and because these technologies have become commonplace. If a state took down our internet servers across the country, our country would come to a crawl, right? It would be like what happened after 9/11, where all the planes were grounded and nobody could move. I know when our internet goes down in our house, it's we have to scramble the jets, and so I think that's where we should be looking at and where we are looking.
AI as just a technology and a philosophical underpinning of our current society has massive implications for the possibility of eradicating human discomfort, essentially. It can erase, if used properly, the ability or the requirement for people to practice subsistence. And they would be able, theoretically, to be, if this is properly used, we can use robots to take care of all the menial stuff, basically. And we can, as a society, possibly move past that. So I guess this is more of a question aimed from the business perspective. In a capitalist society such as our own, is it possible to move towards a place where people can depend on robots for taking care of the kinds of things that we don't want to do so that we may pursue our more creative and other goals? Is that possible in this kind of society? And how do we do that?
So that's interesting. It actually reminds me of the universal basic income questions that people ask about this, but you're thinking about it in the sense of everybody has access to a certain amount of robot technology to take care of their basic needs in the same way that people talk about UBI takes care of your basic subsistence and that frees you to do more creative pursuits and higher level activities. So that's interesting. I mean, I don't know that the technology is there yet. When it does, that's going to be a challenge for social discourse and political discourse, in decision making. We didn't talk a lot about this, but I think those are maybe my greater concerns about AI is what it's doing to sort of societal fabric and ability to communicate with one another and sort of make decisions about these big questions. And that's a way of that I hadn't thought about yet, but it does speak to this issue of does this create opportunity for us to take care of everyone's basic needs.
And Dr. Basha, I recently saw a video called Slaughterbots that was produced by a professor. I forget exactly where, but it was a response to the idea of AI's use in military operations. And recently, there has been talk about how there is one of the major current global superpowers has said that if the UN were to make a ruling regarding the banning of, quote, killer robots from warfare, that they would not list this entity I'm referring to as Russia. They said that they would ignore that. And to me, that is very concerning. How do we prevent militaries from using AI as an ends to I guess, warfare stuff? And should we?
I'm not real sure that that's a technology question so much as a policy and regulation and philosophy question, because I don't think that you can really blame the technology. I think you just blame us as the users and how we decide to use that technology and what we allow to develop, right? So I don't think we could be looking at, I mean, you can always develop technology that basically destroys the other technology, but I believe that's escalating the problem that you are trying to get rid of. And so I think it comes down to more of your policy and philosophy questions. So I'm going to point it this way.
I would say the first thing is to look at home. Start at home. Ask questions about how drones are used by the United States. I mean, they're unmanned. They're not autonomous drones, but there are already, I think, some interesting ethical questions that can be raised about the use of machines, you know, in warfare now and by, you know, by us perhaps, or by our friends. Yeah, I mean, the microphone's right there.
So, how could you prove that a formless AI like HAL, for example, or rather, can a formless AI like HAL, for example, have mental states? And if so, how would you prove it?
That's a question for me? I'm having trouble proving that you have mental states. I mean, that's the old twist. It's called the other mind problem in philosophy, and it's a vexing one. How can we know that other people have minds? I know that I have a mind because, you know, I enjoy it, but I don't know that you have a mind in the same way that I know that I have a mind. I can infer that I do on the basis of your behavior, which, you know, appears, if I watch you long enough, to be intelligent behavior. And so I impute intelligence to you. I attribute intelligence to you because of your behavior, right? I mean, again, I could, you know, do brain scans, but I'm not going to see intelligence in brain scans. Or, you know, the philosopher Wittgenstein talked about having an autocerebroscope, this thing you can connect to your eye that would come around and you can look at your brain acting as it was acting. He said it wouldn't really tell you really anything at all. I don't know if that answers your question. How would we know that they have intelligence? Again, the behavioral test for intelligence with some modifications might be the best option that we have. I mean, think about how we would judge intelligence in a non-human animal. You know, Mr. Horse, are you, you know, yeah, that's right. President Ibeck.
Thank you so much for this panel. This has been absolutely fascinating, and I have 5 million questions that I will control and not ask. But I do want to share with you how exciting this community conversation is and the opportunity that we will have next fall. University of the Pacific has been successful in inviting a Woodrow Wilson Fellow from the Council on Independent Colleges, who is Michael Roden. For those of you who might know, he is just the retired Senior Vice President of IBM, who is in charge of IBM's Watson project. In other words, their artificial intelligence work that's been going on. He's just retired and offered to come and visit universities over this next year, and he'll be coming at the end of October, early November, that week in there. So it's a wonderful opportunity for our faculty and our students to really think about ways in which we can tap somebody who has an incredible viewpoint of both the technology and also the implications of artificial intelligence. So thank you so much for making this a part of the conversation at University of the Pacific.
Gentlemen and Elizabeth, imagine for a moment a group of intelligent humans, no robots, discussing some problem. And one member says, how about this idea? And the rest say, well, that's a great idea. Where'd you get that? I said, well, I thought it up. So where I'm going with that is, can you cite, or does there exist? If so, tell me about it. An artificial intelligence machine or robot that has ever had an original idea.
So one of the interesting areas of machine learning is artificial intuition. I mean, it goes by a number of different names, but it's, you know, so part of machine learning is training machines to recognize patterns, but the other is training machines to generate models. And I can't easily give you the references, but there are a couple of really good TED Talks about taking neural networks which were trained to recognize images and classify them, and then running them backwards, and telling them, you know, the class was an elephant, generate an image that you think would be an elephant. And they generate some really imaginative things. One of my favorites was an AI, a neural network was trained with artwork from various artists. So Van Gogh and Cézanne and some other famous artists. And then what you do is you take a picture of your garden or the lake near your house, and you input that into the neural net, and it produces an image which is that picture as if it was painted by Van Gogh. And so there's a sort of artificial imagination that is being trained into these things.
If I could add a response, Alan Turing in his 1950 paper considered this objection. He called it the Lady Lovelace objection, named after, it was an objection given by Ada Lovelace. And his answer was, let's flip the table. Who's to say that humans are original and capable of genuine creativity? That's what he switched the table. And you think about what creativity is, it's often taking the work of other people and twisting it in some way. So, it's in the defense of the AIs. We can get a question real quick from this very young-looking student in the front row. They're looking younger every year.
Hey, Dad. If there was a super intelligent robot, couldn't it take over you if you were a robot, like a bunch of them? Could they take over you if you were a robot?
I would think so. I hope it doesn't give you nightmares.